Okay, before the break we were talking about children with health-related disabilities and talking about AIDS in particular. And that really begs a question about the relationship we have between medicine and special education. I think it's an important one and an important thing for you to think about. It has implications not only for us as teachers and the population of students that we serve at any given time, but it also has implications for us as a culture and a society. What has happened throughout the ages is that there has been a very reciprocal relationship between what constitutes modern medicine at any given point in time and the type population of learners that we have in special education at any given point in time. And I'll give you an example of something that occurred in my young adulthood when I was teaching school. Probably when I was about high school or college age, someone invented incubators. And so all of a sudden, babies who had been considered low birth weight babies and those who were born premature had a new lease on life, so to speak. You know, now these 5.5-pound babies whose respiratory system was not developed could suddenly be put in an incubator, and voila, guess what happened? That many of them survived, but guess what? What happened with those first babies?
A lot of those babies have visual impairments, and I'm one of them.
Oh, really? I did not know that. It isn't obvious to me visually. I've worked with a lot. Do you have retrolental fibroplasia?
Yeah, I sure do.
Well, that's interesting. I did not know that, but
I've had a replacement of my eye that had the film that you could tell was RLF.
Uh-huh.
Prosthesis, so you can't tell that I have RLF just by looking at me anymore.
No, I could not, but I remember that surprised me, or I would have mentioned it to you at the break. But when I was teaching school, there were many, many youngsters who did have retrolental fibroplasia, and they were easily distinguishable by looking at them. But basically, these babies were the members of a certain group who were born premature and were put in incubators. And they had, medical science had learned to regulate the oxygen so that they would survive, but they had not perfected it. So many of these babies survived, but they ended up with visual disabilities. Well, now, of course, a 5.5-pound baby is considered to be big down at the UT Neonatal Care Center. They're having little babies down there that you can fit in the palm of your hand. So a baby who would have died in the 40s was certainly saved in the 50s, but often at the expense of a visual disability. And those babies now, they have perfected that technique to the extent that they have a very high probability of not only surviving, but surviving with their vision and other sensory things intact. But now, of course, we save babies who are 1 and 2 pounders that would have had absolutely no chance to survive in the 50s and 60s. but who now survive but may have CP or some other complicating factor. So we see throughout medicine and special education this relationship where at any given time we may have a wave of children with one type of disability or another because medicine has learned to save them, but at the expense of a disability. And I think we'll always have that in our future. We will have the compromise that a baby is saved, but there may be a complicating factor that goes along with it. So it's interesting to see how the types of babies we had with cerebral palsy years ago had a cerebral palsy for a different reason oftentimes than the ones who have it now. Mostly with adequate medical care. The babies who have CP now are very, very low birth weight babies who are very vulnerable when they're born. And probably one of these days we'll be able to grow babies in petri dishes, you know, and put them in incubators from there. But once again, it may be at a certain expense. And so I think it's interesting for us to consider that relationship between education and medicine, because many of our children in the physically handicapped as well as other areas fit into this category. There are also other things that probably figure into this and what we do environmentally to others. For example, some of you may remember, or maybe not, the mothers who took thalidomide, the thalidomide babies. Are any of you old enough to have known a child who was a thalidomide baby with the limited limbs? Weren't these kids weren't they the Ewoks? The thalidomide babies. They hired several thalidomide babies for character parts in a movie, and I thought it was Star Wars, but it may have been another movie. The thalidomide babies, they had several of them playing a part, but many of them were born with restrictions of their limbs. Maybe they were missing arms or legs, or they might have a very short limb up here, but their mothers had taken thalidomide during a pregnancy to prevent morning sickness, to keep them from throwing up. And while this drug is harmless in grown adults, it has a very detrimental consequence to a developing fetus, just like rubella. It's the same thing with rubella. And just like we had when I taught school, many of our children were rubella babies. Now we don't have any rubella babies, but we may again if we have an epidemic of rubella. Did somebody over here want to say something a minute ago? No? In any event, your book, of course, again, gives you some guidelines for working with students with disabilities in your classroom, making sure that you are aware of medications that they might need and procedures they need to go through to get them. There may be issues about fatigue or emergency procedures that you need to follow. If you know a child is seizure prone, become instructed on how to handle that situation. We know lots of things that will help able-bodied people in moving and positioning youngsters who are in a wheelchair. It's not nearly as hard as it seems and doesn't require as much strength as you might think it would if you know how to position yourself as well as the child who needs help. And if you have a child in your classroom with these types of issues, you will probably have a paraprofessional, first of all, to provide assistance and even training for you. And second of all, if you don't, there are lots of places you can go for resources and help. The things in this section are pretty much common sense things, and I'd like to move on, since we have a limited amount of time, and talk about severe and multiple disabilities. In the past, this was not a category, but now we consider that having severe and multiple impairments is such an educational issue that we talk about these youngsters in a separate category. First of all, if an individual has a severe disability, there's a greater than chance likelihood that that individual will have a second or concomitant disability. One of the truly unfair things in life is that the thing that puts you at the greatest probability for having a disability is having one already. And second of all, the thing that puts you at the greatest risk of having a child with a disability is of having one already. So a person who has had a couple who has had a normal child is one who is at the greatest risk for having subsequently normal children. So we have an issue with this overlap of handicapping conditions that occurs when something misfires in the developmental process to a sufficient extent that a child has a severe impairment, primarily with mental retardation or whatever. There's a greatly increased likelihood that that individual will also have a second and coexisting disability. Students in this category have severe cognitive and adaptive difficulties, and they require instruction in basic skills like self-help skills and communication skills and functional reading skills, like being able to determine which restroom is for the boys and which restroom is for the girls. We call that functional reading, being able to order from a menu, those kinds of skills. Daily living skills, awareness of their communities and how to get around in their communities, recreation skills, social skills, how to interact appropriately with others and respond to other people in a normalized fashion, vocational education skills, how to apply for a job, how to interview for a job, how to get to a job, these kinds of things. Even though these youngsters have severe disabilities and usually severe deficits in cognitive and adaptive functioning, it's very important for them to have experiences in normalized settings with normalized peers so that they learn how to behave in a normalized setting and will be eligible for things like vocational placement and so on and so forth when they acquire the appropriate skills. It's an interesting thing about deciding what constitutes the best, free, and appropriate education for a child with multiple impairments. And it is important for you to know, that the child or case study committee is really responsible for making this decision as well as all decisions. So that the absolute authority for this placement goes with a case conference team or child study committee team, just like it does for everybody else. But in reality, certainly the parents' preferences are taken into consideration to a large extent. And some parents are committed to the fact that the best educational environment for their child is in a normalized setting. Other parents believe that a specialized setting that is designed just to provide skills for this type child is the best placement for their child. You know, do any of you live in the Sci-Fair area? There was a big brouhaha several years ago about the Carlton Center out in Sci-Fair. Do you know what I'm talking about, the Carlton Center? It's on the campus of the Sci-Fair High School, and it was an educational facility for children who are mentally retarded, and I'm sure many of them were multiply impaired. And it was set up, it was really a neat place. It was set up with kitchens where they learned cooking skills, and bedrooms where they learned to make beds and vacuum and do things like that, and utility rooms that had washing machines. And there was a greenhouse where they learned to take care of plants and things.
Well, I went to Cy Springs High School, and they did have that in the in one of the rooms. But I didn't go to Cy-Fair High School and heard the Carlton, but they did have that in our high school.
Well, it was a whole center that was set up that way, and it became a lightning rod for controversy when the inclusion model came in. And there were parents who were fighting adamantly to close that center and have their children sent to classes in Cy-Fair High School. And there were other parents who felt just as adamantly about the fact that their children needed to acquire the skills that could specifically be taught in that setting. And so that gave rise to this controversy about to open or close the Carlton Center. And in the final analysis, I mean, in my opinion, though everyone is entitled to his own, a continuum of services is always better to me. In my view, we will meet more needs of more people with a continuum of services. And what's right, it's just like her contacts might not be right for you. And so I sort of probably think that the continuum of services best meets the needs of the most people. In any event, some of your adaptation suggestions include making sure that you establish a positive and productive relationship with the paraprofessional who comes to your room. Increase the disability awareness among your students. If you have a group of students in your classroom and you know a child is going to come with a disability that is observable to others, it makes sense to me to prepare the children for the arrival of this youngster. One of the most important things for you to do as a teacher is make sure that you do the things that you're comfortable in doing. But to me, the comfortable thing is to sit down and say, we're going to have a new student in our room on Monday, and the new student is working on these things. You know how you're working on third grade math, and you're working on this, and you're working on that. Well, this student is going to be working on this and that and the other, and he's going to need some extra help. And I would do that with a child who was having cognitive challenges or a child who I thought was going to exhibit aberrant behavior. So everybody would know that this is what is coming, and this is what's going to happen, and this is why the student is getting extra help, and this is what the situation is. I will tell you that in my estimation, the most alarming things in the world to children are the things that we as adults consider too horrible to speak about. Think about it. When you can talk about something, it's not all that bad, right? I used to work in a psychiatric hospital for children who were severely emotionally disturbed. I mean, it's pretty bad when they take you out of your home and lock you up in a hospital, right? Doesn't get much worse than that. Would you agree? Well, of course, I wouldn't dare discuss it. I mean, you know, I certainly didn't mention anything like that to the kids. Why, how would I? And one day I had this epiphany, and I realized they already knew it. If you were 8 or 9 years old and somebody jerked you out of your home, took you out of your school, took you away from your brothers and sisters, and dropped you down in a hospital with a bed with white sheets and nurses walking around in white coats and a lock on every door, don't you think you'd notice something was different? So I finally got to the position of saying, we need to talk about this. The most horrible things in the world are things that are too horrible to talk about, right? So I got where it was very comfortable for me to say to the kid, hey, you're in a mess. You know, they brought you over here. Do you have any idea what you're doing here? Well, of course they say no, even though they do. They say no. I say, well, let me tell you. They told me you're here because you set a cat on fire. We've got some things we need to work on if you don't want to be here for the rest of your life. We better get busy, right? I can help you get better. You know, you're here, but there's a way out of here. There's a better way than this. I can show you. You know, but we need to talk about it because this is pretty bad. You got locked up here, but it can be better. So to me, it's easy to sit down and say, you know, we're getting a new kid. We've all got some problems. Who can talk about their problems? If there's anyone who doesn't, by the time children are 8 years old, they know what their problems are. They know what they need to work on. And so does everybody else by and large. Is there anybody who doesn't have any problems? Nobody I've ever known. You know, sometimes I think we make our problem quotient fit the space available. You know, you worry about your fingernail polish if everything else is in order, right? So it's easy for me to sit down and say to a child, you know, a group of children, we're getting a new kid and we need to get ready for that because he might need some extra help. If you've shared what your problems are, but he's having some things he needs to work on too. And then it becomes an issue where, first of all, there aren't any surprises and there aren't any stares and there aren't any curious questions. And you can say to your child, how do you think you ought to treat him? If it's a child that's deaf, we talked earlier about how horrible it is when people don't understand that someone can't hear and start shouting at them. What do you think it's going to be like to have a child in here who can't hear anything? Have you ever had any experiences where you couldn't hear? Or what do you think that would be like? Or how would we go about discovering that? They'll come up with some really good suggestions about what to do. And not only will they be informed and will they know what to expect so that they don't get any surprises, you will have co-opted them into helping you to help this child. To a large extent, for those of you who are teaching children in kindergarten through 4th grade, they will respond to a child with a disability in much the same way you do. They will take their cues about what is acceptable from what you do and how you relate to children who don't do the right thing. What would you do if you had a child in your classroom and he made fun of the way another child looked? What would you do? You all just aren't brimming with ideas here. You know you're going to be in this position in another couple of years, don't you? Yeah, all right, Brianna. Thank you.
Okay, I'd ask first how the other kid felt, and the other kid would probably say bad or whatever. And then the kid who said the words, I'd say, well, how, does feeling bad, how does that feel, and describe, do you like to feel bad? Do you want someone always saying bad things to you? Do you like when people say bad things to you, and would you like it if people poked fun at you all the time, and if you were the center of attention in a bad way, and just try to have them, because you were saying that some younger kids don't know the perspective, and try to put them in perspective.
It's hard for them to take the perspective of others. They need to be guided to take the perspective of others. I do agree with that. And they need to be guided to relate to a different perspective because they can't ordinarily. That's one reason kids tease each other. and say ugly things to each other is they are not cognitively sophisticated enough. But if that becomes a habit with them, then they learn that as a coping strategy and they continue to say things like that. Yes.
And lots of times I think teasing is just because they don't understand in themselves what's going on. And if they better understand what's going on, then they'll know not to tease, hopefully.
Well, and sometimes kids tease. Sometimes we try different things growing. We try different things as adults. We try different coping strategies. I wonder what would work in this setting. I don't know that we go through that consciously, 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I'll try this. I think I'll try that. But we try all sorts of different things in all sorts of different settings as coping strategies, even as adults, and children do too. And one of the coping strategies that they try is to make themselves feel better by making other people, make themselves important by making other people lesser. And if that becomes an effective coping strategy for them, it's one that they adapt. And if it's one that they learn as inappropriate, then ultimately they drop that strategy and move on. And it's much preferable to me than sending them to the office or, punishing them in some way. The punishment for not playing cooperatively and saying nice things ought to be you don't get to play. Shouldn't be a horrible punishment. You just can't be in a group if you can't play appropriately. Yes, you wanted to add one more thing?
One more thing. Then, yeah, I think I didn't think of it that way. Then maybe show them how it feels good to treat them nicely, because it does feel really good to do good things to someone, and maybe show, hey, when you help them, don't you feel good? Don't you feel responsible? Don't you, feel good about that?
Positive reinforcement.
Positive reinforcement. And, create reinforcement opportunities. The most important thing you can do as a teacher is create reinforcement opportunities. Do you think next time you could be the helper, you could help him do this, or you can help him do that? And then you've created an opportunity. Hey, that was wonderful. And you can reinforce him for that. All of these things are very important things, and they're very natural things. And you know what else they are? They're low-risk teacher behaviors. If they don't work, they haven't cost anybody anything. You haven't made anybody feel bad. You haven't made anybody wrong. You haven't punished anybody. So if they don't work, you can try something else next time. But chances are very good that they'll work. In any event, your book talks about a number of things along this line, developing awareness among your students. It also addresses the issue of curriculum management and having multi-level curriculum instruction. And how we can be talking about the state of Texas and have one group of students determine the economic factors, the population centers and so on and so forth, and another student who identifies the shape and the state capital. So there's lots of levels where we can differentiate multi-level curriculum. But these kinds of things are in your book, and they're pretty straightforward. One of the things that I would like for you to take into consideration is the fact that a large portion of the special ed curriculum that we use for students with severe and multiple disabilities involves teaching these learners the kinds of skills that normal children acquire vicariously. You may know that as a student, nobody taught you to use a telephone book or to read a map or to ride the bus or to fill out a check or to fill out a job application form, these kinds of things. Someone taught you to read and taught you to write, and you just figured out on your own how to generalize reading and writing skills and bring them to this new set of activities that you might need to perform. So you acquired self-help skills and how to take care of yourself and get around in the environment, how to speak with others, what kinds of social skills were important, how to wash the dishes and make up your bed and dress yourself. These kinds of things you already knew before you came to school. But children with severe and multiple disabilities would probably never learn these things vicariously. They would have to be fed for the remainder of their lives if they did not have someone to do this, to teach them how to do these things. So oftentimes it's said that our curriculum for children with severe and multiple disabilities really is constituted of the skill acquisition for tasks that normal children acquire vicariously and without any particular structure of training. It also begs the question, though, and I'm just going to pose this in the form of a question rather than as an answer for you, and that is, when we are talking about a population of students who are focusing on an entire curriculum that we generally don't expose general ed learners to, where is the best instructional environment? What constitutes the best delivery system for that? And I think at some point it's appropriate for many, if not most, children with severe and multiple disabilities to have at least a portion of their training that is highly specialized to these things like running a washing machine, making a bed, and this sort of thing, delivered in an environment that is conducive to that. You couldn't teach a child with severe and multiple disabilities to use a washing machine in an average high school because there isn't one there. And you might have a setting, a more restricted setting that has multiple exemplars of washing machines. There may be a Maytag and a Kenmore and a General Electric, so that the child can learn how to use 2 or 3 different types of washing machines, which even frustrates the best of us. I have a dryer that nobody can operate but me, because it's a Maytag, I might tell you, and where everybody else sets that setting, it blows air, and sometimes I notice the dryers run for an hour and a half and the clothes aren't dry because they set it on the wrong setting. It doesn't go the direction they think it logically would based on how a Kenmore goes. So there's some rationale for training multiple exemplars. Before we go to our guided practice, I want to spend a little time talking about autism. Autism is a disorder that is characterized primarily by impairments in social, emotional, and intellectual functioning, or so says your book anyway. I don't know that that's exactly how I would characterize autism, but that's the party line of your book. Current diagnoses indicate that individuals with autism function along a continuum, certainly from severe to mild disabilities, and that their educational accommodations, of course, must vary according to their level of functioning. Your book estimates that 75% of all children with autism also have mental retardation. I really don't believe that is true by any stretch of the imagination. I don't believe it's true. I believe that many children with mental retardation have autistic-like symptoms, but I think that most children who are really autistic have much higher cognitive functioning than that, but it's very hard to get at. And one of the reasons we have these grim statistics in textbooks is because children who are autistic don't cooperate with the test examiner. I can tell you for sure they don't want to take that test, they don't like being there, and they don't make any effort. And it's just like everything else you don't make any effort doing, you turn in a pretty poor performance on it. And so I think that people who gather these kinds of statistics go out and test any number of students who are labeled with autism, and oftentimes the tester has no personal relationship with the student. It's just very hard to get a legitimate intelligence test score from a student who is A, not verbal, and B, not cooperative. And both of those things you have with youngsters who are autistic. And I just based on my own work with children who are autistic, I don't believe that 75% of them are mentally retarded. I just think that they have many abilities that we have a great deal of difficulty tapping into. But certainly if we don't channel them with effective language and motivation, they are likely to more carefully approximate children with mental retardation as they mature. And it is highly likely at this day and time that you will have a child who is autistic or who has an autism spectrum disorder in your classrooms. For one thing, this is a disorder that is reaching epidemic proportions at this point in time. We are having more and more and more children diagnosed with autism all the time. The increase is profound since the 70s, with no end in sight and no explanation for where these youngsters are coming from. Some people think it's the water, some people think it's vaccinations. I have no idea what has caused this dramatic increase in the incidence of autism and autism spectrum disorders, but I can tell you these youngsters were not in the schools, particularly the high-functioning autistic children that we see now were not in the schools back in the 60s when I started teaching. They just weren't there. They weren't there. Now, many children with severe autism, those who did not have speech by the time they were 5 years old, were often institutionalized and truly came to more closely approximate the mentally retarded. Many of them were institutionalized if their parents would agree to it. But we now have these high-functioning autistic children who have some spontaneous language without any sort of educational intervention. Their speech isn't quite right and their social relation is not quite right. But these kids weren't around 40 years ago when I started teaching school, I can tell you. They weren't there, and they are now everywhere. Now, I should have included a transparency, I guess I didn't, about autism spectrum disorder that talked about Asperger's syndrome. I don't know how I missed that, but this is something that you need to know about. Instead of just autism now, we refer to children with autism spectrum disorders, and these youngsters range really from fairly severe to fairly mild. And one of the syndromes that is associated with high-functioning autism is Asperger's syndrome. And these youngsters are socially a little unique. They're not particularly verbal. They tend to be fairly rigid in their orientations to things. They need a lot of structure and a lot of planning, and they don't tolerate surprises and changes very well. And it is highly possible, if not probable, that you will have a child with Asperger's syndrome in your class. And I believe you spell that Aspergers, Asperger's syndrome. But these kids are definitely prevalent today, and ones that are not unlikely to be encountered in an inclusive setting. Years ago, when we first began to speak about autistic children, I think I read the first book ever written on the subject, and it was published in 1960, as I recall. But we thought that youngsters with autism, first of all, it was characterized by the fact that they had little or no useful speech. They simply did not start talking or did not develop language like normal children did. They may have said 2 or 3 words at one time and used them appropriately, but over time language dropped out. They may have been children who talked with echolalia, what we call things like TV commercials. You know, they might mimic TV commercials. Like we had a child one time in the hospital. There was this ad for spaghetti sauce on TV, and the punchline was, "Mamma mia, them are mighty spicy meatballs." And he would say that just out of the blue, but he wouldn't say anything that made any sense. And when you spoke to him, you'd say, "Hello, what is your name?" He'd say, "Hello, what is your name?" I'd say, "No, not my name is Gay. What is your name?" He'd say, "What is your name?" You know, whatever you said to him, he would repeat back, and we had such a difficult time getting him to break that pattern of speaking back what we had said rather than answering the question that we had asked. That's referred to as echolalia. But anyway, these youngsters have severe impairments in their ability to speak. They tend to relate to people more like objects. So if they want to go out the door and they don't know how to open the door, rather than asking you to open the door, they'll take your hand and put it on the doorknob like they're using you for a tool to get the door open. Tend to not be enthusiastic about a lot of interpersonal contact. If you pick them up, they tend to be rigid and not like that. There are several characteristics that were indicative of that original syndrome that was associated with what was called infantile autism. And initially this was thought to be a result of poor mothering, the poor mothering that they had received. But of course now we know that that is absolutely not true. But probably more sins were perpetrated against the mothers of these poor children than anybody else, because they were just treated like they had done something terrible to their children, or they wouldn't have children like this. It was really a throwback to the Middle Ages, really, the way many of those mothers were treated. Of course, it had nothing to do with them, but nevertheless, as the incidence of autism has run rampant, we have more and more children on a much broader continuum, and we refer to those as autism syndrome, you know, autism spectrum disorders. So that's about it for Chapter 4. I'm going to let Kim do your guided practice now. We'll break for a work session.
Hi, everybody. Studying my notes. Dr. Goodman wanted me to concentrate today on teaching children with autism for several reasons that we'll cover. So that's what we're going to work on today. First of all, we're going to start out with a little vocabulary lesson today. So I hope y'all are feeling smart. Anyone know what the word enigmatic means? It's a good word to know. It's one of those that's going to be on those tests you take. Enigmatic. Any idea? Every time I think of autism and children with autism after my many years of teaching, this is the word that pops into my head. It means difficult to interpret, understand, or explain, mysterious or unknowable. So every time I think of children with autism and autism as a disorder, that's kind of the word that pops into my head. Because the disorder of autism is so enigmatic, there are many myths about autism. I'm going to give you all a little quiz, and everybody has to participate. These are myths that a lot of people think are true or know they are true about autism. So I want everyone to participate when I ask you whether you think these are myths or fact about autism. Children and adults with autism do not care about others. Who thinks that's a myth? If you raised your hand, you are correct. Children and adults often care deeply, but they lack the ability to spontaneously demonstrate that. I've seen that in a lot of children with autism. When given the chance and the tools to show that they care about others, that comes out. Here's another one. Autism spectrum disorders are increasing in incidence. Now, if you were listening, you might know this one. Who thinks that's a myth? Who thinks it's a fact? It is. A lot of people say, oh, the only reason we have more autistic kids is because we know what it is now and we're identifying more of them. That is not true. It is increasing in incidence at epidemic levels in some states. There are 10% more children with autism now than there were 10 years ago. So it is increasing in incidence. And Dr. Goodman told you a little bit more about that. All people with autism spectrum disorder have savant skills, you know, like Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man. Myth or fact? Who thinks it's a myth? Who thinks it's a fact? No? It is a myth. Most people with autism spectrum disorder do not have any special savant skills, but you will find children with autism who have splinter skills. They may be really talented artists. They may be very good at math. They have a splinter skill that is not consistent with their other skills. It is better to wait and see if you have a child that is not developing correctly rather than refer them for diagnostic assessment. Who thinks that's a myth? It's better to wait and see. It is a myth, yeah. It's not better to wait and see. You should. The earlier autism is diagnosed, the better. Earlier treatment that begins, the better. And the last one, certain intensive behavioral-based programs cure autism spectrum disorder if they are delivered at the right age and intensity. Who thinks that's a myth? It is a myth. There is no cure for autism. It is a lifelong disorder, and definitely there are treatments and interventions that improve the disorder, but there is no cure for autism. Autism has always fascinated me for several reasons. One is the history, and Dr. Goodman told you a little about the history of autism. I'm freezing. In the 40s, you had Dr. Leo Kanner and Dr. Hans Asperger. I wonder where Asperger's syndrome comes from. Looking at autism and trying to diagnose it and identify it and operationalize it. And then in the 50s and 60s, you had Dr. Bruno Bettelheim, who said that it was all the mother's fault. He called them refrigerator mothers. Okay? They were cold. It was a psychological disturbance caused by detached and uncaring mothers. Can you imagine telling a mother your child is like this? It's your fault. And a lot of the therapies were aimed at the mothers as opposed to the kids. So they could bond with their children so their children would not be autistic anymore. Then finally, in the 60s and 70s, a doctor named Bernard Rimland started to show that autism had was a biological condition. It had a biological base to it. And then it's gone on from there. Autism, big spectrum. That's why it's called autism spectrum disorders. You can have a child that is very low functioning, that you're just teaching functional daily living skills, how to dress themselves, how to feed themselves, how to toilet themselves, etc. Nonverbal, you have to teach them how to communicate in some way. And then the other end of the spectrum, you'll have a child with Asperger's syndrome, for example, that's very high functioning as far as academics, but still has all those social abnormalities, those social problems. Has anyone ever heard of Temple Grandin? Very good. You had her for a class? Oh, you're very lucky. She is actually someone who has Asperger's syndrome. She is a PhD. I think she got her PhD from University of Colorado, if I'm not mistaken, in animal sciences. I'm sorry? Colorado State. In animal sciences. And she does a lot of work with the ethical treatment of livestock. But if you ever get a chance to see her speak, sometimes she comes to Houston. She's very interesting to go see. She talks about what autism feels like. And it's very unusual to hear that because a lot of children with autism, of course, can't tell you what it feels like. So it's a valuable experience. If you look her up on the internet, there's a lot of good articles and a lot of good things about her. She is on the other end of the spectrum. And then you have everything in between. The interventions that are popular today are mostly behavior-based interventions. Has anyone ever heard of ABA? Applied Behavioral Analysis. This is, you have to be trained in how to use ABA, and then they'll work with the children with autism, but they are behaviorally based. So that's just a little bit about autism, a little bit of background. The most important thing with children with autism, I always think of it as kind of a pyramid. You know, Maslow, he has that pyramid of the most important, then you move up. Communication. You have to establish some form of communication for children with autism. Next is social skills. They have to be able to interact. Functional daily living skills, and then of course academic skills. Yes, ma'am? I would put it at the top, yes, because if a child can't communicate with you, how's that person going to tell you what he wants, what he needs, and how are you going to find out what they are learning? There's got to be a way to communicate. And mobility, of course, if there's a physical impairment. As Dr. Goodman said, a lot of the skills that children with autism don't have are skills that other children learn vicariously through others. By imitating, by watching, by understanding other people's feelings and reactions. These are the skills that children with autism are lacking. 10 important lifetime goals for children with autism. I'm going to go through these rather quickly because I want to have time for everything else. To initiate, work on, focus on, and complete tasks. Okay? Use only safe behavior. Take complete care of own body. Understand appropriate touching. Respect others' property. These are all areas that children with autism will have trouble with, and you will need to work with them, hopefully along with the special educator in your building, in the classroom. Know who to ask for help and know how and when to ask for help. This is a very important one. Learn to identify internal states. I'm angry, I'm hungry, I'm sick, and express them appropriately. Express negative feedback. Okay? I don't like that. I don't want to. That is for the child's safety and for them to feel independent and feel that they can tell you, I don't like that, I don't want to do that right now, I want to do this, because that's where the frustration comes from with a lot of children with autism, is they can't communicate that they don't like something or don't want to do something. Deal with unexpected changes in routine, problems. This is probably one of the areas that we work on most with children with autism, because the unexpected and problems come up, they get very frustrated. They like things to be very, very structured as a rule. And understand yes and no and how to redirect their attention when they're told no. Okay, a lot of children with autism don't understand yes and no. Okay, that's where you have to start. What does, when I tell you yes, what does that mean? When I tell you no, what does that mean? And that will help them with their relations with other children too. When you're setting up activities, an environment in your classroom for children with autism, it needs to be very concrete, very visual, and very structured. A website that I direct you to for your assignment is called do2learn.com, and I'll show you the website in a minute. Back in the olden days, you all have it so great because on these websites, oh, they have the forms and the pictures and the picture strips and everything you need. You just print them out and you put them together and you got them. In the old days, we had to draw and find pictures and put our own materials together because there just weren't things to use with children with autism. So you all are very lucky to have the resources you have these days. Some of the ways you can work with children with autism in your classroom. I'm just going to give you some examples. This is an example of a work system. Now these are things that I would go as a special educator, go into the classroom and help teachers set up for children with autism. If they are in their room for part of the day or most of the day or maybe just a small part of the day. And before I go on, I think it's important to remember too, you may have a child in your room with autism purely for social reasons. On their IEP, these are their social goals, their social emotional goals, and that's what we're doing in your classroom. They may not be in your room for academics, and that's fine, and the special educator will help you set up things for that child with autism in your room. This is just a little workstation. It's a work system. It's a concrete visual way to tell the student what you want them to do, what order you want them to do it in. You see everything is color-coded. They do number 1. They take the number 1 off the strip and they put it in the little finished envelope. They do number 2. They take the number 2 off the strip, put it in the little finished envelope, do activity number 3, and so on and so on. So it's a way for the child to understand what is expected, how much he has to do, and he knows when he's finished. Very structured. Okay? No frustration. They know exactly what's being asked of them, etc. So you can set up, there are just loads of ways to set up workstations for children with autism. Another thing that is helpful is communication folders. We use these a lot in the special education classroom as well as the general education classroom. Everything the child needs is right here to do his work task for that day. He has this assignment. He has his little checklist. He can keep track of what's expected of him. He knows when he's finished. He even has little cards that he can use to ask for help. Okay? He's having trouble. Instead of getting frustrated, not knowing what to do, he can take one of his little communication cards that says, I need help, and take it up to the teacher or take it to another student. And that student or teacher can help him with his work. There's also that you can see there a restroom card. This is for children who are either nonverbal, okay, or just learning to express themselves, and they still need some help. The picture cards can be used. A lot of kids will use sign language. It's a good idea as general education classrooms to know teachers to know a few basic signs. Okay, I'll go over with a few if we have time today. So that's a work folder. Another thing that children with autism will use a lot is what we call request strips. People call them different things. But this is a strip of paper they have. Okay, I want, and then they can just fill in the square with one of the squares they have in their notebook. Okay, I want a pencil. I want to go to the bathroom. I want to go to the library. Could be people in school, places in school, things to do in the classroom, food, okay, any of those things. So this is a way for them to express their needs and wants in the classroom. Down at the bottom there, that is a communication notebook. Each page is a category of things, and the kids can point to pictures so they can communicate with you. Okay. I have found in teaching children with autism is when children can't communicate with you what they need, what they want, how they feel, that is when the frustration comes in, and that's when the behaviors, start to erupt. The inappropriate behaviors. For more, actually this is a good idea if you have any preschool teachers in here. This is a wonderful idea for preschool teachers also. Any of these ideas will work with children, any child. Okay, you might have a child with Down syndrome. You might have a child with any other disability. These ideas will also work well. This is a reminder strip. This happens to be washing your hands. It just breaks down the skill into pictures and words so they can follow along, okay, and figure out how, I need to wash my hands. I forget how to do that. Okay, so the activity is sequenced by behaviors, and it's very visual. They can see exactly what they need to do. If any of you have 2-year-olds at home, this is not a bad idea either. Visual schedules, a visual calendar. Okay, I know what to expect. Today is Wednesday. This is what I'm going to do. Good for children with autism and younger children. Just so they know what to expect. And oftentimes you'll have them take the picture off as they do each thing and just put it in a little envelope. I've done this, this is what's next. I've done this, this is what's next. Okay? It gives them a feeling of independence, a feeling of security, that they know what's coming next. Works very well. This is an augmentative communication device. This is just a sample of one. There are many, many different kinds. You'll see them, they hang around the neck. Some kids will have them on a wheelchair. This is a Talkmaster. But it's the same sort of thing, except it's verbal. They'll press the little picture, maybe 3 pictures, and make a sentence. Okay, so it's a way for them to communicate. There's been, remember when we first started using these, people would say, oh no, don't do that, then they'll never learn to talk. They'll just use that thing all the time. Okay? So of course they did research on it, and that was found to be untrue, that kids with augmentative communication devices actually learn to talk faster because they had a model right there. Okay? So you might have children in your room, children with autism and other disabilities, cerebral palsy, that use augmentative communication devices. When we were working with a little boy, I shouldn't say a little boy, he was 17 years old, in high school, and he wanted us to key in some phrases in his augmentative communication device that 17-year-old boys say to each other that maybe we wouldn't have done normally. So we thought about it for a long time, and we did. We keyed those phrases in for him because he wanted to feel part of the crowd. Another thing you can do is homeschool communication type things. When your children with autism go home, they're just as anxious to tell their parents what they did that day, and their parents want to know what they did that day so they can communicate with them. Oh, I see you did this, and I see you did that, and you went to music, and you did seat work, and you had an assembly. So it's always good to have some kind of homeschool folder that can go home. So your children with autism can go home, and their parents can talk to them about what they did that day. Let's do one thing before we get to kind of what the assignment is going to be. I'm going to teach you a little bit of just basic sign language. Do we have any signers in here? You may not. It's good to know some basic sign language for facilitated communication. A lot of times after the children with autism, a lot of times children with autism, you'll start with actual objects. For example, if that child wants to blow bubbles in the PlayStation, we'll have a little bubble wand that he can bring you and say, like Dr. Goodman was saying, an object. This is what I want to do. And then maybe you go to photographs. After they know the objects, you'll go to photographs of things they want to do. And then maybe you'll go to pictures. Okay? And then maybe you'll go to words. But all along there, you may have to use some signing. So just some basic signing that children with autism and other disabilities. Yes? Everyone do it with me? This is yes? No? Okay? Or you teach kids to do this with their head, of course. A lot of times it's time to play. It's 2 Ys. Time to play and time to work. Okay, that's a big one we use. After we work, we can play. I've done that a billion times. Let's see, what's another? Oh, restroom. Different people, I just use RR. RR. And if kids can't cross their fingers, you can come up with a little different one. I used to have a little plastic toilet on my desk that some kids used to come up and hand to me, and I knew that they needed to use the restroom. There's a lot of ways you can do facilitated communication. So these children, and as I said, I believe that's the first step you have to take. So these children can tell you what they want, what they need, how they feel, okay? And so that frustration doesn't build up. I'm going to take one of those 10 skills that we want children with autism to learn. Deal with unexpected change in routine. deal with the unexpected, otherwise changes in routine, change in problems. My goal for that child would be the student will remain calm when there is a change in schedule. My technique, okay, using one of those things I showed you, would be to use the visual calendar, show the student beforehand when a change of schedule will occur, and discuss the activity with the support of social stories and or visual aids. Okay, so I have my skill, one of those 10 skills that we want children with autism to learn. I have my goal that corresponds with that skill, and then I have the technique that I will use to accomplish that goal. Social stories, and I wish I had put one in here. I'll try to remember and bring one next week. Social stories are stories usually with visual aids that you use with children with autism, and it's usually a story about something they're going to do, somewhere they're going to go, some way they're going to act. For example, every time I took one of my students to an assembly, assemblies set him off. Okay? They were a lot of people, a lot of noise, a lot of sensory input. Very scary for him. So before we went, we do a social story. Okay? I'll use the name Adam. Adam is going to an assembly. Okay. He will sit with his hands in his lap. He will clap when everybody else claps. Okay? You know, and things like that. Otherwise, exactly what to expect, exactly what's expected of him. Okay? A social story. What do? And the social stories help them know what to expect, and it's kind of a rehearsal. Okay? This is what I'm going to do when I get there. All right? So those are social stories. I can't remember the name of the woman who does social stories. Do you remember Dr. Goodman?
No, but I have it now.
Yeah. Very, very useful. If your special educator in your building doesn't know about social stories, I find they work remarkably well with children with autism, especially the higher functioning kids with autism, and you can even act them out. You can have the kids in your class act out social stories about what is expected. This is how you act in this situation. This is how you socialize, things like that. Okay? I'm going to go back. Let's take one of these 10 important lifetime goals. Someone suggest one for me. Pick one, anyone. Someone suggest one for me? Yes, ma'am.
Use only safe behavior.
Okay, use only safe behavior. Excellent one, because kids with autism often don't know what is safe and what is not in the classroom and outside the classroom. Can someone think for me of a goal then that would fall under that skill heading? What would be a goal? Yes, ma'am.
Not running
In
the hallways.
Okay.
Or in line or...
Exactly. Not running in the hallway, not running in line, not running in school, because that's unsafe behavior. Then what is one of our techniques that we looked at that might... not going to go for me. What's one of our techniques that we looked at? I'm just going to kind of show them to you. That might help that child remember not to run in the hall, or a technique that I've mentioned. I can think of a couple come to mind. How about if I help out a little bit? Can anyone think of using a strip like that to remind the children not to run in the hall? Go ahead.
I was going to say that, and you could also have posters in the hall, because sometimes schools have posters saying not to run, but you could have like a picture of someone walking.
Any kind of visual reminder.
And also you could do rehearsal, like run and then walk, and then run and then walk, and show, well, appropriate behavior in the hall is to walk.
Almost like a social story. Okay. When I walk in the hall, I don't run. I don't run because I could fall. Okay. Social story, any kind of visual strip, visual reminder. I don't run in the hall. Okay. So any of these ways to communicate will help children remember, okay, and practice their social skills and their communication skills. Two pieces of information I wanted to give you. There's the helpful website, the do2learn.com website. I also put it on your guided practice. Excellent website. Oh my gosh, the wealth of information at this website. If I had had that 15 years ago, I would have been the happiest woman on earth. Would have saved hours and hours of work. They have everything you can think of to help children with autism. It will be an excellent resource for you as a classroom teacher, not only for children with autism, but for all of your children, okay? And all of your children that may have disabilities. An interesting book, if you are interested in autism, a very interesting book to read is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. It is written from the viewpoint of an autistic boy, and it kind of gives you an inside view of what it feels like to have autism. It's a quick read. It's not very hard. It's not technical at all. Okay, it's just this little boy and what he goes through and what he feels like as a person with autism. So I think if you have any interest in this area, I think you'll find it very interesting. I want to end today with a little story. And this is written by a little fifth grade girl now. In 4th grade, I was one of the first kids introduced to Erin, who has autism. I became her seat partner, and we became friends. This was Erin's first year at our school. It was her first year in an inclusive classroom. She was probably scared. She didn't talk, and she would kick and run away if you tried to talk to her. As the year went on, she learned that nobody else kicked. She learned that kicking just got her into trouble. She had been in special education classes before, and maybe everybody else kicked too. After being in a regular classroom, she learned that kicking was not okay. In 5th grade, Erin and I were in the same class again. She would talk to a few of us. When she came out to recess, she would play on the bars with us. She didn't kick anymore. That was a big change from 4th grade, when she didn't want anything to do with us. Now that we are 6th graders, Erin talks. She will say hi or bye, and will answer my questions and talk to some people. I go to PE with Erin on Tuesdays. She will play basketball, do jumping jacks, or whatever is required. I also helped Erin in music for a while. She would be the loudest singer in class. We also would pass out papers to the 1st graders. I really like working with Erin because it's fun and because it makes me feel good knowing that I am helping her. I hope we will always be friends. I hope all of your students have that same experience. Thank you and good luck.
And you cowards back there that wouldn't sign, I hope you have students that are complete duds. And sit there and go.
No signers back there?